Hi guys, and welcome back. It's finally time for us to use the AWS tools for PowerShell to create our first SNS topic. So to do that, we're going to, of course, use the new SNS topic command that we talked about in the previous video. Now, even though we're talking about automating the AWS platform, it can be helpful to refer back to the AWS Management Console in case you need any feedback about the different commands that you've been running. So if we were to switch back over to the SNS console here, we will be able to see a list of our topics. In fact, you can see that I've got some old topics right here that I can go ahead and clean up. And we can also view our subscriptions as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and clean up a couple of these topics here. And as you can see, the process of deleting topics is a fairly manual one using the AWS Management Console because it's giving us this extra confirmation prompt in case we are accidentally deleting a resource that we did not intend to. Now, using the AWS tools for PowerShell, if you had a list of 100 different topics, it could cost you a lot of different time to go through and individually click each of those topics, click the delete button, paste in that delete me text, and then click confirm. So regardless of how many SNS topics you have, if you need to clean up a whole bunch of them, you can do that very effectively using the AWS tools for PowerShell. Now, the other reason that you'd want to use the AWS tools for PowerShell instead of the AWS Management Console as well is that we can check our code for PowerShell into source control. So if we create like a setup script, for example, that maybe creates an SQS queue, maybe it creates an EC2 instance, maybe it creates some Lambda functions, and it could also create an SNS topic for us, we can define that inside of a large script and then rerun that script as many times as we need to rebuild our environment from scratch and avoid having to come out and manually click all of these buttons in order to provision and configure the resources in the way that we need them to be. So we're just going to start from scratch here with no topics. Actually, there's just kind of a default CloudWatch topic that it created, but I'm just going to leave that one alone for now. And so let's switch back over to Visual Studio Code. And if you're following along with the GitHub repository, we're going to be working inside of this 04 directory for create an Amazon SNS topic. So this is going to be what's called an imperative approach to creating resources. There is also something we'll take a look at later, which is AWS CloudFormation, which allows you to perform a declarative deployment of resources. And that's nice because you can define all of your resources that you need in a cloud environment inside of a YAML configuration file, and then you can deploy that as a single entity called a CloudFormation stack. But in this case, what we're doing is we're basically going to create some imperative tasks, which explicitly creates an SNS topic, and then goes ahead and creates a subscription to that topic. And our subscription is actually going to be using this third-party service called webhook.site, which basically all it is it's a webhook endpoint that you can use to test out webhooks. So instead of having to set up my own webhook endpoint, I can simply come out to webhook.site. It'll give me this unique webhook URL, and it will allow me to basically send messages to that. So we're going to be using this as a sample for this video of a subscriber. So let's switch back over here to Visual Studio Code, and we'll take a look at this create SNS topic script right here in the 04 directory. And the first thing we need to do is to come up with a topic name. Now, there are certain topic naming rules around certain special characters that you can't use, and I don't think you can put spaces in the name either because that would break the ARN or Amazon resource name. But I'm just going to come up with a simple name here like new orders. So imagine that we're creating an ordering system for an online retail service, and we're creating an SNS topic that accepts new messages anytime a new order comes in so that we can then notify other application components that a order has been created. So I'm just going to define a variable called $topic_name, and that will store the value of the topic that we're going to create here. So I'll hit F8 in my IDE here to initiate that line, and it'll just define the variable. It's not actually performing any tasks. So now we actually want to create the SNS topic. So to do that, we'll use the new SNS topic command. And as I type out here, you'll see I get this auto completion. And when I add on a parameter, it actually auto-completes the parameter names for me as well. So there's a name parameter, a tag resource management parameter, there's an attribute parameter, and a bunch of other common parameters that are common either to AWS PowerShell commands or just PowerShell in general. So the name parameter is going to allow us to define the name that we would like for the SNS topic. So I'll hit F8 on that line to run it. And in the PowerShell integrated terminal down here, you'll see that we get back the ARN, or Amazon resource name, that uniquely identifies this resource inside of our AWS account. So right here is my AWS account ID. Here is the name of the SNS topic. And here is the AWS region that this topic resides in, the US West 2 region. So now we have created this topic, but we need to get a reference to the topic so that we can manage it later on. So if you have not stored a variable with this ARN from the new SNS topic command, maybe you're running a completely separate script that's managing your topics, there is a get SNS topic command that allows you to retrieve a list of topics inside of the region that you specify. My default region is just set to US West 2, but if you wanted to, you could of course override the region using the region parameter to something like US West 1 or any of the other supported regions. So if I were to just run get SNS topic by itself with F8, you'll see that I get back the list of ARNs here. So it's actually an object that just has one property, which is the topic ARN. So it's a pretty simplistic object, but keep in mind that it does have a property in order to retrieve the ARN. It is not just a flat string that is being returned. So now I have two different topics inside of my account, so I want to filter down to only the topic that I am working with here, which is new orders. So to do that, PowerShell has a built-in command called whereObject, and whereObject is a command that allows you to filter a pipeline of objects. So basically we're taking these SNS topic objects that have a topic ARN parameter, we're filtering it into this whereObject command, and then basically we're saying, give me any topic ARN where when I split it on a colon and index backwards by 1, so that's actually going to give me, instead of the first index here, it's actually going to give me the last index of that resulting array, and then it's going to compare this value at the end of the array to my original topic name that I defined in a variable. And so if that matches, it will return the object, and because you can only have one topic with a given name, then it will return back a single object to me. And it'll store that in a variable called $ordersTopic. And if I just enumerate that variable here, you can see that it has a topic ARN property on it. And so I can now use that topic ARN property to manage my resources. So for example, if I wanted to examine some more detailed information about my SNS topics, I could use this command called get SNS topic attribute, which has a topic ARN parameter. And so of course I have to pass in the ARN of my topic. So to do that, I would reference my orders topic object and then grab the topic ARN property, which again is the only property it really has on it that's useful. And so if I hit F8 to run that, you'll see that we get back some more details around this topic. We have a permissions policy, we have of course the ARN itself, we have the owner, which is the account ID that owns it, and things like how many subscriptions have been confirmed, how many subscriptions have been deleted, an optional display name parameter, and the delivery policy options as well. So now we need to subscribe an endpoint to the topic. And so to do that, we go back to this command we talked about in an earlier video called connect SNS notification. So basically we're connecting an endpoint over to this topic. So connect SNS notification, if we take a look at the help for it, I'll just fire up my terminal here and do help connect SNS notification. And it has a few more parameters because now we have to specify the topic ARN that we want to subscribe to, but then we also need to provide the details of the subscriber itself. And again, we're going to be using that webhook.site website as a test. And so what we're going to do is grab this URL, which is going to be our webhook URL, and it uses the HTTPS protocol. Now, so for the protocol, you can do different things like email protocol, you can do HTTPS protocol, and there's a couple of other protocols as well that are available, but we're just going to use HTTPS in this particular example. So when we look at the help for connect SNS notification, you'll see we do have the protocol parameter, which will be set to HTTPS, and then the endpoint parameter, which specifies the actual path to the endpoint. So in this case, that'll be our URI to our webhook endpoint right here on webhook.site. So let's go ahead and fire this up, and I'll come over here and just paste in my webhook endpoint. I don't think that's actually changed at all because I haven't recreated that. And so basically those are the only parameters you really need to worry about. Now, one of the things that you'll notice is that when you run connect SNS notification, the endpoints need to be confirmed. And so what you'll see is that we get a message that was posted, an HTTP post message in webhook.site here, and it provides us the raw content down here, which is basically just a big JSON string. And there's a specific property there called the subscribe URL. And if we take a look at subscribe URL, it's basically just an HTTPS URI that we can plug into our browser, or we could use any other, like a PowerShell command. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. Let's switch over here to PowerShell. We'll do invoke REST method -URI, and then we'll go ahead and paste in this really long subscription URI here. And as you can see, we get back this confirm subscription response. So it looks like everything is good there. So if we were to switch back to the AWS Management Console here and go to subscriptions, you'll see that we should now have a subscription confirmed for new orders. And sure enough, right over here, you can see the topic new orders, and you can see the subscription identifier right here. So that's pretty much all there is to using the AWS PowerShell module to create a topic and add a subscriber to that topic. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.